Now this is music I have heard a hell of a lot of in my life. Oh boy. I've spent a lot of time on the world map in Final Fantasy VI, everybody. When you want to totally break the game and teach every single one of your party members Ultima, it's you got to fight a lot of low-level enemies that give you a lot of AP. AP? I think it's AP. SP? EP? It might be EP. Eidolon points. Anyways, you can just attach a summon to any character in Final Fantasy VI. That summon usually has a list of spells that they learn as you just kill enemies and gain experience with them equipped. And generally you'll get, like, I think it's AP, like 3 or 4 AP per enemy. So you want to go to places where there's a lot of high AP enemies or a lot of low AP enemies that you can kill quick. Get through a lot of different fights and then teach people, maybe even well, because Ultima's a max level skill, so you got to learn every single skill on that summon. And yeah, but it is, you shouldn't do it. Remember, yeah, I feel like AP makes sense in my head as well, but it's the way that Final Fantasy VI, from the midway point, it's very easy to just totally decimate the last boss if you want to. Like, I mean, granted, you're breaking the challenge a little bit, so there's an argument as to why maybe you shouldn't, but it is definitely possible. So if you're ever worried about, because I mean, there are JRPGs in which some of the late game enemies will level you, and Trails in the Sky 2. I want to say, is it 2 or is it the first? I think it's 2. No, it's the first one. The one, or is it 2? Hey, Tim, you might know this, where you have to fight Estelle's father. And it's like the most ridiculous boss fight ever. It's so much harder than the rest of the game. It's unbelievable. And Trails from Zero, as well as Trails to Azure, I believe, have that as, or is it Azure? Azure has a similar fight that's really tough against one of the 7 Deadly Sins people. JRPGs aren't too grindy generally. It's just if you want them to be easy, they are. Like, they're grindy if you don't have, like, really good command of the mechanics and systems and how you can most effectively use your skills and items and understand the economy. Like, there's a whole lot of things you can do in a JRPG to be good at them. Mostly a matter of time. Yeah, I mean, like, that's true, although I think that at the point you get to those fights in Trails of Cold Steel not Trails of Cold Steel, Trails in the Sky and Trails to Azure, it's like, ooh, man, yeah, like, that's a hard place in the game to ask people to, like, go back and grind a whole bunch. Like, I'm talking huge difficulty spikes, like, oh, I have no chance against this guy unless I radically alter my builds, my equipment, how I'm approaching this fight, the skills I'm using, the characters I have in my party even. Like, I remember it being pretty rough. And that's something Rocky knows a little bit about, right? Get it? Like R-U-F-F, rough. See, now, this to me, though, does not seem too dissimilar from the type of storytelling and things like Final Fantasy Tactics.
Are rather more far-reaching than we assumed.
More expansive lore-based Final Fantasy stuff. Like, it doesn't feel like 4 or 6 or 7, but it does seem a bit like the Ivalice stuff, having just a bunch of different types of tones and types of lore. Because I know this isn't Ivalice, like Eorzea is a different place, because apparently there's some return to Ivalice quest lines, but it's like a lot of the same races and stuff, so it seems like it's very much the same type of universe that 11 and Tactics and Vagrant Saga were. Vagrant Story were in. Yeah, see, Jose Gonzales agrees. It feels like the Tactics lore dumps. Like, yeah, Final Fantasy Tactics has a lot of lore, man. Like, people that are like, oh, that's one of the best stories. I'm like, do you remember it? I'm like, I understand people saying Tactics is one of the greatest games, but the story is very dense, and I like it, and I could see a lot of people liking it, and I mean, like Jimmy Cobb says, Final Fantasy Tactics has great writing. That's true, but that is one that a lot of people are just like, I don't even know what was happening. I was just like, okay, yeah, whatever, like, let's just get on to the next battle. But I was like, it's there's a lot going on in Tactics, man. They're like, yeah, blah blah blah. Eventually, Cloud shows up. I was like, if you got Cloud, you worked for it. That's not an easy side quest to do by accident.
I have a chunker of a question to bring up. So it's a thought experiment, and anybody can chip in, but more of a ship, a thesis kind of a thing, right? How far removed of the original Final Fantasy do we get until it's a Final Fantasy game? And I think I told you yesterday I'm working on a script for the Final Fantasy 16 review I want to do.
Yeah.
And that question is like the most dividing factor. I've seen so many essays on like, I don't like this game. It doesn't feel like Final Fantasy to me. But you never get to that question of like, what is Final Fantasy for you? What does it mean to have a Final Fantasy game, right? Are we strictly talking about the 4-party member turn-based combat of the original game? Like, do we account for active battling like in the 4th game? Or do we go the route of tactics, which is more like I consider it to be more of a Final Fantasy story game, but still, like, how far removed do we get?
Yeah, I think I've always seen Tactics as a spin-off, and I think that most of the genre flexibility tended to stay within spin-offs, and some of them wouldn't even have Final Fantasy in the title, like Ehrgeist. Does anyone know what Ehrgeist is?
I do.
Yeah, it's a fighting game. Like, it was probably Dissidia is probably what came out of Ehrgeist, which was probably the first experiment of, hey, what if we made a Final Fantasy fighting game? I find that the biggest mistake this franchise ever made was keeping it numbered, probably going into PS2. Because I think that's around the point that... Because the Final Fantasy XI was being talked about for sure at the exact same time that Final Fantasy X was being developed. And I don't think you could ever make the argument that was not the case. Like, there's no way they had no clue 11 was going to be an MMO when they were making 10. So with that said, if they'd called 10 Final Fantasy the Summoner's Journey or something like that, like about Yuna, or like, I don't know, like, call it whatever you want. Final Fantasy Sin, you know, like, name it after the villain if you want. I honestly think that people would be much more flexible with what a Final Fantasy game is, because if each one of them was allowed to be its own thing from the ground up for a longer span of time, I think people would be okay with it. But I think it's adding the numbers into the mix that's given people a cognitive bias to not like anything that is realistically unlike whatever their favorite Final Fantasy was. But I think that's why it's important, and why, again, like, I think Jimmy Cobb's perspective is valid as well, and I wouldn't even argue with someone that even says, I don't know, Final Fantasy X is not real Final Fantasy to them. I'd be like, okay, why? It's like, well, it has voice acting, I can't name the characters. I'd be like, oh, well, okay. Like, if that's the threshold for you, then I don't really have an argument against it, because it's your opinion, really. And I'm not saying that, oh, it's your opinion, which means it's not real, it's not the objective truth. I'm saying, no, it's like, I don't think there is an objective answer, an objective standard by which you could say this is the point at which it no longer becomes a real Final Fantasy game. Because I think that the only one you'd really be able to assign to that is real-time combat. You know, like once you can move your character around, I think then it becomes a very different from a genre standpoint. Like, it's a very different type of player that will naturally gravitate towards real-time combat where you control your character position versus strictly menu-based, turn-based combat. You know, that's a different kind of player. It would be like if Civilization 7 was a real-time strategy game. You know, like, there would be people that are just like, what the fuck? Like, I don't want to play Age of Empires. I want to play Civilization. It's like, yeah, well, get over it. Civilization is real time now. Like, I appreciate that you could make the argument that, like, yeah, but it's not Civilization anymore, you know? So I think I first of all, Jose, I wish you good luck writing your video, because I think that's I'm not saying good luck in a sarcastic way. I mean, actually, like, good luck, because I think that's
I laugh because I understand it. That is a big undertaking, because, as you said, the definition of Final Fantasy depends on a lot of the entry points for a lot of people. There's a lot of hardened defenders of the post Final Fantasy VII era, as well as people beyond 13 and even just the MMOs. Like there's a lot of perspectives when it comes to what makes a good Final Fantasy game or what is a Final Fantasy game. And I'm trying to stare at this from a mechanical standpoint, just to try not an objective definition of what a Final Fantasy game is, but rather what a Final Fantasy game with certain mechanics would be. Because let's say, 10 years down the line, we're looking at a VR implementation of Final Fantasy. By necessity, the mechanics there are going to be very, very different. You could implement a turn-based system around it, right? You would have VR positioning like you do with a lot of games where you portal around different areas and attack from that said area, or defend a certain position.
You could also have it just play like Final Fantasy VI, but you're in a voxel-based version that looks kind of like an Octopath Traveler thing that you're looking at as if it's a game board on a table, but at any point you want, you can also just decide to go in and walk around it. Then it's kind of like a Minecraft-y sort of Final Fantasy VI Super Nintendo RPG world that you're in. Like, I mean, there's a lot of ways that you could do those things, but I think you're right. Ultimately, decisions would have to be made on how to adapt a genre of game that has never been in that medium to a new medium in the case of VR. In the case of all of the numbered Final Fantasy games up until this point, though, because there's been no actual medium change, there's been medium changes for things like the art design, like going from pixel-based to polygon, for example, or like diorama-style pre-rendered bitmap backgrounds and polygon characters to fully polygon characters and environments and everything. Like those are fairly major changes, and I think that there's a lot. The most difficult task, I think, for writing that script would be to have it in a way that you can lay out the terms of what people ought to view as the deal breakers for Final Fantasy. Like these are the things that need to be in Final Fantasy, or else it no longer should have that title at all. Because I think that ultimately that threshold is very thin in a literal standpoint. Because the second you give the game the subtitle, I think all bets are off. Like, I think you can make it anything once there's a subtitle. I think the problem is the number convention. The number convention being the signifier of, like, this is the next mainline Final Fantasy game. This is the follow-up to Final Fantasy 15, I guess, in this case, which people will say that's real, not real Final Fantasy. Okay, it's the follow-up to Lightning Returns. Final Fantasy 13. Okay, no, that one's not real. Okay, 12. A lot of people would be like, that one's not real. I'd be like, okay, well, we're going back. Like, we're in the PlayStation 2. Like, 10, I guess, like most people would say 10 probably is still real Final Fantasy, or you could, but that's what I mean. I almost think that it's a term that has only become difficult because of the numbers. And I think that ultimately they're going to have to drop them before 30 anyways. They're not making Final Fantasy XXX. It's never going to happen. Right. I don't believe you.
And that's precisely where I want to take that ship. I want to steer the conversation into that, right? Like, how many degrees of separation do we need to go to before we say, all right, that's a good representation of what a Final Fantasy game ought to be? And then the next question comes up, right? As somebody might ask, wouldn't a sequel necessitate a departure, right? To justify the advancements in technology, the creator's vision, all of that taken into account. And I'm with you in the sense of we shouldn't continue the iteration or the numbering system to represent these kinds of games, because they are such a stark departure of what Final Fantasy was at the start.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it gets a little bit more muddy if we're just going by titles, in the sense of, if you want to make an overarching mythos, how far do we go and what are the titles that constitute that mythos? Like, I liken this to things like Warhammer, where you could look at Vermintide, Darktide, all of these games, and even the tabletop, but there's an overarching or unifying age and history behind all of this. that gives a sense of location and time. Final Fantasy weirdly doesn't have that
It
beyond the
does.
icons
Yeah.
and crystals, right? But
Well, I
there
know,
isn't
but
an age
there's
to them.
Ivalice does. So that's what I was saying. The world in which Final Fantasy Tactics, Vagrant Story, Final Fantasy 11, and Final Fantasy 12 all take place, that does have consistent lore. And I believe that
Right.
I think it was that Final Fantasy 14 OG also took place in Ivalice, and then the world, like, there was an apocalypse, and then the Realm Reborn's now Eorzea, or is it something like that? Because I don't know the deep lore on the OG. Actually, I mean, if anything, Myrddin would be able to tell us about this because he actually was around for the OG one. But I don't know. Like, I think though it is a very meaty topic, and it's one that you probably have a lot of leeway on how you can approach it. Although it's going to be very difficult to. Yeah, either way, you're going to anger some people and. Some people will agree with you, and this, there's no way to get everybody to agree on this. That's one thing that I have accepted, which does not mean it's not worth talking about. I think that's another thing that people especially hate when that happens on the internet. Well, it's like, well, no one's going to agree on Disney Star Wars or not, so you might as well just never talk about it. I'm like, well, no, that's just because I'm not going to talk the Raylos out of liking The Last Jedi doesn't mean I can't talk about why I think The Last Jedi is bad. Like, I just think that's faulty logic, but yeah.
I agree, and I think there's a lot more to be found by just going through the conversation alone, just going through the arguments of what we found, what's there, right, and ultimately what ought to be. I think yields a better kind of environment overall, rather than just leaving it as is. And that's what spurned this script of mine, just going through the Final Fantasy 16 streams and reviews all around. And that was always the dividing or the starting line of, this isn't Final Fantasy, or, oh, this is very much like Final Fantasy. And I have to take a step back and ask myself, like, do I think it's a Final Fantasy game? And then ultimately, what is a Final Fantasy game?
Yeah, I think probably the best way to approach that, I would say, would be to say, hey, what would you ideally want Final Fantasy 17 to be? And if are you, I would say your thesis would be, I would say my ideal thing would be that it is not called Final Fantasy 17, whatever it ends up being. I think that is ultimately the answer, but it would be interesting to say, okay, but let's say it is going to be Final Fantasy 17. What is the game they could make which would make the most amount of people happy and be like, yeah, Final Fantasy is back?
Right, and I'm with you, and I think there has to be some level of departure from that, as well as a way to inherit what was there. If you want to involve the mythos, if you want to involve all the things around what we like about Final Fantasy, right? Mm-hmm. Be it the summons, being the crystals, being the world, the races, all those things. Yeah, you can see Final Fantasy as a series of games that keeps like a certain narrative or lore, but mechanically every dev can do their own thing as they get the iteration. I agree with that, but I'm also of the notion that you shouldn't call them numbered, because it gives off the sense of we're getting the same of the, more of the same, just more of the same, which is not exactly true. And that's kind of where a lot of the points of departure happen for people, as you're saying, from 6 to 7, the whole 3D thing just caused such a big divide.
Well, also 7, 8, and 9 are all quite a bit more linear as far as storytelling goes than the Super Nintendo ones were as well. And that's a big thing that people often bring up, that it's pretty much just a straight path, that your choices as far as your loadouts in battle don't really matter as much as they did in the Super Nintendo games, that you don't have as much flexibility. And you can make arguments to or for, I think, any of those things realistically. Although it's been a while since I played the PlayStation ones other than 7, so I can't really speak very confidently on 8 or 9 because I've not played either of them in years. But one thing I think would be interesting is, how's this for a little thought experiment? If there's Final Fantasy 17, is they just say, fuck it, we're just going to give it to Capcom and let the Devil May Cry team make Final Fantasy 17. And then at the same time, though, there was a Final Fantasy spin-off that was given to the Persona team. And it was just, they're like, yeah, we're making a turn-based Final Fantasy game. So we make turn-based RPGs, we're going to make a turn-based Final Fantasy game. It's going to be really, really good. And it was a spin-off. I think there's a lot of people that be like, yeah, the Persona Team one that's Final Fantasy 17, really. So I think that ultimately it probably comes back to most people likely putting their roots in it being turn-based versus real-time. But also, I mean, I think that it's weird if you don't include 10 in that, because 10 was still turn-based. It wasn't active time battle. It was more straight turn-based, where you actually see who the next turns are in line. There's less mystery to if you're going to get your attack commanded before the enemy's going to attack you. But you know, like I think 10. I don't know. I don't know if there's an argument against 10. Like 10 is like, oh man, this is not even the same franchise. Like, it definitely is.
I do have a bit of a monkey wrench to that. So I've thought about this, and I'm an ardent defender of the Super Nintendo era of Final Fantasy, but I also appreciate what the 3D games did. Final Fantasy IV does have an active battling system, which means if you don't take your turn, the enemies are likely to attack you while you wait.
Yeah, and that's what they changed in 10. They kept that through until 10 from 4.
And that's what I mean. Would we consider Final Fantasy IV not a Final Fantasy game?
I don't think anyone would, because I honestly think most people that are having this conversation, including me, I want to be clear, have not played Final Fantasy 1, 2, or 3. I'm not saying no one has. I'm saying there's like the vast majority of people have not played 4 or 6 at this point. Like lots of people who play Final Fantasy now started with like 10 and or 15, you know, like or 13 even. Like it's been a long time since your first Final Fantasy game is almost definitely going to be 4 or 6.
Exactly.
Arguably it wasn't even when I was a kid. Because for most people my age, I think it was 7.
And that's where I want to bring the argument, right? Because I was lucky enough to play a lot of those on portables. Like Game Boy Advanced and PSPs were really good for a lot of these like Final Fantasy 1 through like 5 collections. And that's where I got a lot of them through. Now, mechanically, yeah, there's a bit of difference, but the Game Boy Advance ones were at least as close as you can get to the original. What I was trying to get at earlier was just very quickly, I was able to contrast a lot of these things since I kept my Game Boy games from the past, and I was going back and forth between, you know, Final Fantasy VI, 4,
the GBA ones.
Yeah,
those are good versions actually.
Oh yeah, they're very good. And
the best version of 4 though is the PSP one.
I was able to contrast that, and there's a lot of similarities to active battling systems, not being exactly a turn-based battling kind of game, and there's a lot of mechanics in there that depart greatly when you consider 1, 2, 3 to 4, 5, and 6 that a lot of people don't really take into account. And we were talking about the opera scene. That's inherently a cut scene kind of mechanic where you see a lot of games today. It's not exactly you know, a traditional storytelling kind of a thing, where it was just a wall of text and somebody explaining things to you.
There was gameplay to it. You do have to select her next line from the opera, or you do fail it. Like it is something that you can fail. It's not like, oh man, you have to remember the lines too. It's not like, hey, press X to sing next part. Guaranteed, if they do a Final Fantasy VI remake, it's gonna be press X to hit to sing next line, or they'll be like time it in the rhythm, or it'll be a dance sequence.
Exactly. Well, and that's where the question comes in, right? Like, what do we contextualize as a cutscene, and is that a departure from what you would normally get, where it's just a bunch of text or people talking around a certain topic? Like, where do we go from there to say, by necessity, this is different. By necessity, this is something entirely not like the originals. Like, where do we go from there? And that's where I wanted to go into this conversation. And we won't get into an answer, right? There's not an easy answer for this. Like you said, it depends on what your point of entry was. But at the same time, I want to call out some of the things that you can objectively, particularly with the battle systems, particularly with things like you have cutscenes in the game. And then when you take Final Fantasy 1 and 2 into modern consoles, like they did with the PSP and the PS2, how are those inherently different from the original ones, right? Not from a remake or remodeling kind of conversation, but is it still a Final Fantasy game? Is it still Final Fantasy 1? Like, all these questions will come up, and I haven't seen a really good answer for them, which is why the topic was just stirring in my head, because everybody will have their position, but I don't think a lot of people have a good definition of what that is.
Yeah, and I wish you very good luck with your video, writing it and trying to at least have the conversation. But thank you very much, Final Fantasy XIV players, for hopping in, and Jose for sparking a conversation that I'm willing to bet Classy Vigilante will cut up into a video. And hey, this might be the end of the video right now. Goodbye, everybody. All right.
See ya.
Take it easy, everybody. Thank you for all the support.